15-year-old Liam loved riding his bike through the quiet streets of his small town, soaking in the simple beauty of the neighborhoods. It was late spring, and the air was alive with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. Most of the houses were framed by neat gardens, each one a small masterpiece of color and care. But there was one house at the corner of Sycamore Street that looked completely out of place. The garden was wild and overgrown, with weeds tangling over the pathways and shrubs left to grow in haphazard shapes. The once beautiful flower beds were choked with grass, and vines climbed freely over the cracked stone fence. It belonged to Mrs. Waverly, an elderly woman who rarely left her house except for her slow afternoon walks. Liam often noticed her garden on his way home from school, and it bothered him more each time. He remembered seeing Mrs. Waverly once or twice, leaning heavily on her cane and moving carefully like her bones were made of glass. She always gave a polite nod or a small smile but never stopped to chat. Liam thought about how much work it would take to restore the garden, and how impossible it must be for someone her age. That day, as he rode past, he stopped at the corner and stared at the garden. Something inside him pushed him to act. He didn't know why he cared so much, but the idea of offering to help wouldn't leave his mind. Parking his bike against the stone fence, he made his way to the front door. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, unsure if she would even answer. When the door opened, Mrs. Waverly stood there, her thin frame draped in a light cardigan, her glasses slightly askew on her nose. She looked at him curiously, as if surprised to find a visitor. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Can I help you, young man?" "Hi, Mrs. Waverly," Liam said nervously, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I live a few streets over, and I noticed your garden looks like it might need a little work. I was wondering if you'd like some help with it." Her expression shifted, surprise giving way to something gentler, though her brow furrowed slightly. "That's a very kind offer," she said, glancing toward the garden as if seeing it through fresh eyes. "I've been meaning to do something about it, but I suppose I haven't had the strength." "I'd really like to help," Liam said, his voice growing more confident. "I can start today if it's okay with you. It might take a while, but we'll get it looking great again." Mrs. Waverly looked at him for a long moment, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That's very generous of you. I can't imagine why you'd want to spend your time doing that, but I'd be grateful for the help." "It just seems like the right thing to do," Liam said simply. She invited him inside for a cup of water before he got started. Her home was modest but filled with warmth, with framed photographs lining the walls and shelves. Liam noticed pictures of smiling children and families, but there were no recent photos, only older ones. He wondered if they were her children or grandchildren and why no one seemed to visit. They sat for a moment in her cozy living room, where she explained that she had tried calling a few companies to handle the garden, but they were fully booked for weeks. "I thought about asking my family," she said with a small sigh, "but they live too far away to help." "I can do it," Liam assured her. "It'll look good as new in no time." That afternoon he ran home to gather some tools from the garage: a rake, pruning shears, and gloves. Returning to the garden, he worked tirelessly for hours. He pulled weeds from the flower beds, pruned the shrubs into clean shapes, and cleared away piles of dead leaves. Mrs. Waverly watched from the porch, occasionally offering tips about the plants or chatting about her late husband, who had loved tending the garden. By the time he finished for the day, the garden looked better already, though it was far from done. Mrs. Waverly seemed amazed by the transformation. "You've done so much," she said, her voice touched with emotion. "I can hardly believe it's the same garden." Liam smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'll come back tomorrow and keep going. We'll get it perfect." Her face lit up with a warmth that made her seem younger for a moment. "Thank you, Liam. You don't know what this means to me." As he rode home that evening, Liam felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. There was something about helping Mrs. Waverly that made him feel like he was part of something bigger, even if he couldn't quite explain what it was. Little did he know, his small act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he never expected. The next afternoon, Liam returned to Mrs. Waverly's house with a wheelbarrow and a larger pair of shears borrowed from his neighbor. The day was warm, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air as he approached the garden, which now seemed less wild and more manageable thanks to yesterday's efforts. Mrs. Waverly was waiting for him on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a wide-brimmed sun hat perched on her head. She greeted him with a smile and waved him over. "You're becoming a familiar sight around here," she said as he approached. Liam grinned. "I'm just getting started. We've got a long way to go." He set to work immediately, focusing on clearing out the patches of wild ivy that had crept over the fence and choked the bushes along the edges. As he worked, Mrs. Waverly slowly walked over with her cane and began pointing out plants he hadn't noticed before. "Those roses over there," she said, gesturing toward a scraggly bush with a few faded blooms, "used to be my pride and joy. My husband planted them for me on our anniversary years ago. They haven't bloomed properly in ages." Liam paused, taking in the story. "I'll see if I can bring them back," he said with determination. She smiled softly, her eyes distant. "That would mean a lot to me." Over the next few days, Liam made a routine of coming to Mrs. Waverly's house after school. Each visit revealed new layers of the garden's former beauty, as well as new glimpses into Mrs. Waverly's life. One day, as he dug through the soil to plant new seeds she had stored in an old tin, Mrs. Waverly brought him a glass of lemonade and settled into a chair nearby. "I haven't had this kind of company in a long time," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Really?" Liam asked, brushing dirt off his gloves. She nodded. "My children are wonderful people, but they're all grown with families of their own. They live so far away, and life keeps them busy. I understand, of course, but the house feels quieter these days." Liam looked up at her, feeling a pang of empathy. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to be alone so often. "Well, you've got me now," he said with a cheerful shrug. Mrs. Waverly laughed softly, the sound like a small bell. "Yes, I suppose I do." Their conversations grew longer and more personal with each visit. Mrs. Waverly began sharing stories about her late husband, their travels, and the memories tied to certain plants in the garden. "This lilac bush," she said one day, pointing to a gnarled shrub, "was a wedding gift from my mother. She said it would bring us good luck, and it certainly did for many years." Liam listened intently, feeling like he was uncovering a treasure trove of stories with every session in the garden. Though the work was hard hauling wheelbarrows of weeds and trimming stubborn branches, he found himself looking forward to each visit. One Saturday, Mrs. Waverly surprised him by stepping out of the house with a large straw basket. "You've worked so hard these past weeks," she said. "I thought we could have a little picnic in the garden to celebrate." Liam helped her spread a checkered blanket under the shade of a tree that had been cleared of its overgrowth. The basket was filled with sandwiches, fresh fruit, and cookies she had baked that morning. As they ate, Mrs. Waverly's face lit up with delight at seeing the progress they had made together. "It's starting to feel alive again," she said, looking around. "This garden was such a special place for me and my family. Seeing it like this makes me feel closer to those days." Liam nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "I think it's getting there. Just wait until the roses bloom again." By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Liam packed up his tools and prepared to head home. Before he left, Mrs. Waverly stopped him at the gate. "You've done more than just clean up a garden, Liam," she said, her voice warm and steady. "You've brought life back to this place and to me." He smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mrs. Waverly." "Until tomorrow," she replied, waving as he rode off. What had started as a small act of kindness had grown into something much deeper. Liam found himself thinking about Mrs. Waverly's stories even when he wasn't at her house, and he felt a quiet determination to make her garden a place she could be proud of again. Little did he know, The days he spent with her would leave a lasting impression on both their lives. As the weeks passed, Liam found himself visiting Mrs. Waverly's home more frequently. Though their connection had started with the overgrown garden, it soon became clear that their friendship went far beyond that. One day after school, Liam decided to stop by, not for any particular reason but simply because he enjoyed her company. Mrs. Waverly answered the door with her usual warm smile. "Liam, what a pleasant surprise," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in, dear. I've just brewed some tea." Inside, the living room felt as cozy as ever, with soft afternoon light streaming through the lace curtains. On the coffee table was a small tea set, complete with a plate of biscuits that looked fresh from the oven. "You're just in time," she said, settling into her favorite armchair. "I baked these this morning. They were a favorite of my grandchildren when they were little." Liam sat down across from her, inhaling the buttery aroma of the biscuits. "They smell amazing," he said with a grin, reaching for one. As they sipped their tea, their conversation flowed naturally, weaving through memories and reflections. Mrs. Waverly shared stories about her childhood, painting vivid pictures of summers spent on her grandparents' farm and winters huddled by the fire with her siblings. "There wasn't much to do back then," she said, chuckling softly, "but we found our fun. My brothers and I used to sneak into the barn to play hide and seek, even though my grandfather swore it was no place for children." Liam laughed, trying to imagine her as a mischievous young girl. "Did you ever get caught?" "Only once," she said, her eyes twinkling. "My grandfather found me hiding in the hayloft. He was trying to look stern, but I could tell he was holding back a laugh. He ended up letting me stay there while he told me stories about his own childhood." Liam loved hearing these glimpses of her past. It felt like stepping into another world, one so different from his own. In return, he shared bits of his life, what it was like at school, his dreams of becoming an architect, and the little things that made him smile, like riding his bike down the steep hill by the park. "You have such a bright future ahead of you, Liam," she said one afternoon, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "I can see it in the way you talk about your dreams. You'll go far, I know it." Her words stayed with him long after he left that day. Though he'd never sought out her approval, hearing her belief in him filled him with a quiet pride.
One Saturday, Mrs. Waverly invited Liam for tea again, and they sat by the window watching the soft spring rain fall outside. She seemed quieter than usual, her gaze lingering on the gray sky.
"Are you all right, Mrs. Waverly?" Liam asked, setting down his teacup.
She smiled faintly and patted his hand. "Oh, I'm fine, dear, just feeling a little tired today. But having you here is the perfect remedy."
Liam nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was weighing on her. He stayed a little longer that day, chatting about lighter topics to bring back her usual warmth. By the time he left, she seemed more like herself again, waving cheerfully from the doorway. But the next Monday, when Liam stopped by after school, there was no answer at the door. Frowning, he knocked again, then peeked through the window, but the curtains were drawn. He decided to come back the next day, thinking she might be resting or out on an errand. That evening, his mother received a phone call. When she hung up, she turned to Liam with a solemn expression.
"Liam," she said gently, "I'm so sorry to tell you this, but Mrs. Waverly passed away in her sleep last night." The words hit him like a stone, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "She seemed fine," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "We were just having tea on Saturday."
"I know," his mother said, pulling him into a comforting hug. "She lived a long and full life, Liam, and from what I've heard, these last few weeks brought her so much joy. You meant a lot to her."
Liam nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. Though he hadn't known her for very long, the bond they'd shared felt deep and meaningful. The memories of their conversations, her laughter, and the kindness in her eyes would stay with him forever.
He didn't know it yet, but Mrs. Waverly had one last surprise waiting for him, something that would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. A week after Mrs. Waverly's passing, life in Liam's small town carried on as usual, but something felt different to him. The house at the corner of Sycamore Street seemed quieter than ever. He had stopped by once to stand at the gate, unsure of what he hoped to find, but all he saw was the empty garden, now blooming beautifully but missing the warmth of its owner. One afternoon, while Liam was at home trying to focus on his schoolwork, the doorbell rang. His mother answered, and moments later she called him to the living room. Standing there was a man in a neat suit, carrying a leather briefcase. "Liam," his mother said, her tone curious, "this gentleman is here to see you." The man introduced himself as Mr. Bernard, a lawyer who had been handling Mrs. Waverly's estate. Liam felt a pang of sadness at the mention of her name, but his curiosity grew when Mr. Bernard pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is for you," Liam the lawyer said, handing him the envelope with a kind smile. "Mrs. Waverly included you in her will. She wanted to make sure you received this personally."
Liam exchanged a surprised glance with his mother before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter in Mrs. Waverly's elegant script, along with a document that made his hands tremble as he read it. "Dear Liam, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Please know that your kindness brought light to my life in a way I hadn't felt in years. Your visits gave me something to look forward to, and your friendship reminded me of the joy that can come from the simplest moments. You've got a good heart, and I believe in your dreams. I want to help you reach them. I've left you $100,000 to use however you see fit, whether it's for your education, your family, or just chasing what makes you happy. It's a small token compared to the joy you've brought me, but I hope it helps. With love, Mrs. Waverly." Liam stared at the letter, his emotions a whirlwind. $100,000, he whispered, barely able to process it. Mr. Bernard nodded. Mrs. Waverly was a very wealthy woman. Most of her estate has been passed to her children, but she wanted to leave this gift specifically for you. She made it clear how much she appreciated your kindness and how much it meant to her in her final days. Liam's mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her own eyes misty. "Liam, I don't think she could have said it better. You made a difference in her life." Over the next few days, the reality of Mrs. Waverly's gift began to sink in. Liam couldn't believe that someone he had simply tried to befriend had left him such a life-changing gesture. He shared the news with his family, and though they were as shocked as he was, they encouraged him to think carefully about how he wanted to use the money. Liam decided he wanted to honor Mrs. Waverly's memory by putting the money towards something meaningful. He opened a savings account for his future college education, where he hoped to study architecture and set aside a portion to help his parents with household expenses. But he also made a promise to himself. Every year he would do something in Mrs. Waverly's name, whether it was planting a new tree in her garden, donating to a charity she would have loved, or helping someone else the way she had helped him without even realizing it. One sunny morning, Liam rode his bike to her house, which was now in the process of being sold. He stood at the gate, looking at the garden they had nurtured together, and smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Waverly," he said softly, "for everything." Though she was gone, her memory would always live on, not just in the gifts she had given him, but in the lessons she had taught him about kindness, gratitude, and the power of connection. And for Liam, that was the greatest gift of all. The summer after Mrs. Waverly's passing felt like a season of change for Liam. Though he missed her presence deeply, her gift and her memory inspired him to move forward with a new sense of purpose. Her words in the letter echoed in his mind often, especially when he thought about the way she had believed in his dreams. One of the first things he did with the money was to help his parents in small but meaningful ways. His dad's old car had been breaking down constantly, and Liam suggested using part of the gift to get it repaired. Mrs. Waverly would have wanted this, he explained when his parents hesitated. She cared about family. With their reluctant agreement, the repairs were made, and Liam was proud to see how much easier it made things for his father. He also secretly set aside some funds to surprise his little sister with a set of art supplies she had been eyeing for months. Watching her face light up as she opened the gift reminded him of the joy Mrs. Waverly must have felt when she planned her own surprise for him. But the most significant part of the gift was the savings account Liam opened for his education. He didn't tell many people about it, but it gave him a sense of security and excitement he had never felt before. For the first time, his dream of becoming an architect felt achievable. He spent hours sketching ideas for homes and gardens, often thinking of Mrs. Waverly's house as his first inspiration. One day in late summer, Liam decided to visit her garden again. The house had been sold to a young family, and he was curious to see if the new owners had kept up with the garden's beauty. To his surprise, the yard was flourishing. The wildflowers they had planted together were in full bloom, and the roses were as vibrant as ever. As he stood at the gate, the new owners came out, a friendly couple with two young children. They introduced themselves and asked if he was a neighbor. Liam explained his connection to the garden and to Mrs. Waverly, and they listened with interest. She must have been a remarkable woman, the wife said, glancing at the flowers. This garden feels so full of love. She was, Liam replied, smiling. And I think she'd love to know it's still being cared for. The couple invited him to come by any time to visit the garden, an offer he gladly accepted. Before he left, he walked through the yard one more time, touching the lilac bush they had revived together. It was as if a part of her spirit lived on in the beauty of the space they had worked so hard to restore. That fall, when school started again, Liam carried himself with a quiet confidence that was new but felt natural. His friends noticed the change, but he found it hard to put into words. How could he explain that the simplest act of knocking on a door months ago had set off a chain of events that reshaped his life? One day, during a career presentation at school, Liam stood up to talk about his dream of becoming an architect. He spoke about wanting to design spaces that brought people together, inspired by how a single home and its garden had connected him with someone who changed his life. My goal, he said, his voice steady, is to create places that feel like more than just walls and roofs. I want them to feel like home. That's what Mrs. Waverly's house and her kindness taught me. After his presentation, one of his teachers approached him. Liam, you're already building something special. You're building a legacy of kindness. The words stuck with him. Though he knew there would be challenges ahead, Liam felt ready to face them, carrying Mrs. Waverly's lessons with him. Her gift had been more than just money. It had been a reminder of the power of connection, the importance of kindness, and the value of believing in someone. Years later, when Liam graduated college as an architect, he designed his first project, a community garden in his hometown, open to everyone and free to use. He named it Waverly's Haven in honor of the woman who had believed in him when he was just a boy. Standing at the garden's grand opening, surrounded by people of all ages enjoying the space, Liam looked up at the sky and smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Waverly," he whispered. Her impact on his life, he realized, would never fade. Through the kindness she had shown him and the kindness he now spread to others, her legacy would live on forever.